Morning, morning. With us at the desk throughout the show, Stephen Fry, writer and broadcaster, Zanny Minton Beddoes, the editor of The Economist, and the former Chief Whip and Conservative Cabinet Minister Simon Hart, who was by Rishi Sunak's side in the grisly last days of his government and who's been busy spilling secrets. Bit more of that later on. But let's start, as we always do, with the news on this important junction. There's tons of coverage looking ahead to critical. So plenty to talk about, and very warm welcome to all of you. Zanny, of course, the focus for most people in the news at the moment is what's happening in Ukraine. And The Economist had a very striking front page this week. Just tell us what moved you to describe this moment as Europe's worst nightmare, as it shows.
Well, this is Europe's worst nightmare because, as you can see on that cover, there are two people talking to each other, Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin, and a lot of empty chairs, which are the people who ought to be at this conversation, Volodymyr Zelensky, the Europeans, for example. And the big shock this week is that on the eve of the third anniversary of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, unprovoked invasion of leading to the biggest war in Europe since the Second World War, the shock has actually come from Washington. And it's come from President Trump, who has attacked very personally Volodymyr Zelensky, called him dictator. And the outright hostility from the US in the last week led us to think that the Europeans should question whether the US would actually be there for them in wartime. That's why it's Europe's worst nightmare.
Zelensky, you've been out there, you've been trying to help people through what's been, such not just a conflict, but also a crisis for civilians. What's on your mind at this moment?
Well, we might get into this later, but I'm deeply worried by the darkening shadow that's going over the world, the shadow of what we have to call fascism.
You would use that word?
Oh, absolutely. It's a cult of power, and power only speaks to power. And the worry is the contempt that Trump, as Putin always has, the contempt that Trump has for British politicians, whoever they might be, for Macron. We'll see what happens in Germany. They've tried to push the Alternative for Deutschland, the ultra-right party. They've tried to, Vance and others have supported it. So it is a real worry. It's a desperate time.
Let's just think back, though, to the moment of the invasion itself, because all of this comes on the eve of the anniversary. Simon, you were in government when, the call must have come that Russian tanks were rolling across the border. What was that like?
Yeah, I remember it only too clearly. It came, it felt like about 24 hours after we'd just lifted the final restrictions on the pandemic, on COVID at the time. And I remember thinking sort of with disbelief that so soon after that extraordinary pressure on the country, another one had emerged.
In the budget that the Chancellor set out last year, we did commit an additional £3 billion into defence.
And we'll come to all of that, but on that specific point, was Donald Trump right or wrong to suggest that Keir Starmer had failed to do anything to try to end the war?
We've stood squarely behind the Ukrainian people and President Zelensky, and that has been the consensus across political parties in this country. That's what I'm doing right now, and I really welcome the discussion that we're now able to have on education, something that wasn't the case before the general election. The changes that I'm setting out through the bill will still require failing schools to become academies, because we will step in. I will not flinch in stepping in to make sure that schools that are not delivering the best life chances and standards for our children have a change of leadership.
But the changes that we are making,
the changes that we're making in the bill cover a range of different areas.
The relationship with Donald Trump and Keir Starmer, Simon Hart, someone who's been in government when you had prime ministers having to deal with him. It is tricky. Fascinating, though, there to hear the Secretary of State very, very clearly Donald Trump was right to bring in Vladimir Putin. Were you surprised by that?
I was surprised by that. I thought up until this moment that actually where Starmer was positioning himself, and indeed where Kemi Badenoch is positioning himself, is quite sensible, reserving the right for us to call out Trump, should we consider that to be necessary.
Fear gangsterism. And I think it's, to sort of use TV shows, this is not The West Wing, this is The Godfather. And so everybody around the world is scratching their head thinking, how do I deal with Donald Trump? And what do you need to do? You flatter. You try to minimize any kind of disagreement. You try to turn your asks into something that brings him a win. And that conversation was really striking to me, because I think the Education Secretary is doing her best to try and kind of paint this as though there was no disagreement. I think what is important, and I completely agree with you, is that when push comes to shove, differences are called out. And actually, this government hasn't been doing too badly on that. Last week, the Prime Minister did call out
firsthand in Ukraine.
Yes, one can use rhetoric to suggest that this is peacemaking and that all that Donald Trump wants to do is end the war. But I think Zanny is absolutely right. This is a new world. We are talking about a very extraordinary situation now where the bullies have risen to the top. And I've called it fascism because that's what it is. It's a cult of power and a cult of warrior worship, and a rather sentimental one at that, and a total contempt for the old world order. And you have to remember the psychology of a bully from school. Bullies feast on the fear that they cause and on the, think of Joe Pesci as you're talking about, in Goodfellas, you're talking about a gangster movie. Look at who Trump admires. He admires Mohammed bin Salman's Saudi Arabia, Putin's Russia, obviously, Lukashenko's Belarus, Erdogan's Turkey, Milei's Argentina, Modi's India, Netanyahu's Israel, places which are basically moving towards fascism, nationalism, and they don't listen to people like Starmer. So as long as he kind of says, yes, I can be an honest broker. Do you remember Macmillan's phrase that he used in the 50s, an honest broker, as Peter Cook famously said, no nation was more honest and certainly no nation was broker. But he, yes, and he will be called a nice guy by Trump until he then says something which really expresses his support for Ukraine, which is what he has to do. And then he'll be slapped down and said, I thought he was nasty. He was nasty. And it's shouting and it's bullying and it's fascism. And we have to realign ourselves in recognition that this is no longer the proper world.
And yet, Simon, many people would reckon that...
I think President Trump is absolutely right, is that Europe needs to spend more on defence. And that's where I was actually struck by the Education Secretary saying that 2.5% was ambitious. I think we might come to this, but 2.5% is not ambitious. And President Trump is right to push Europe, including us, to spend more.
Well, yes, let's talk about those wider implications, because with Ukraine's future in doubt, these are very nervous days of...
There's always been sort of quite ambitious targets, and I've never quite understood sometimes whether they're just a bit arbitrary. What do they mean? What does it mean in terms of recruitment? What does it mean in terms of equipment? What I think is unquestionably the case at the moment is just adding a few percentage points here and there, which will take 5 or 10 years to have actually any real effect.
Way in which our government and other European governments can rectify this situation if you believe they're in the wrong position?
Yes, I think they're in the wrong position, and I think they all need to spend a lot more fast. Accept that, or assume that was the case now. So it's a completely different world than it was 10 days ago.
Really,
that means a lot more money on defence. 1%, we need to be getting to 3%, possibly even more. Behind it is there for it. And so this needs a fundamental rethinking of European defence.
But Stephen, many people watching, they might feel very concerned by what they're hearing, but also voters want money to be spent on the health service. They want money to be spent on public sector pensions. They want better pay if they work in the public sector. They want potholes in their roads fixed. So
the world is upside down. And yes, as an old lefty who's always thought that, spending on defence was criminal and terrible in a world where poverty and famine and everything run riot, it's strange to change one's views, but that's what you have to do when the world changes. You can't stay the same necessarily. Churchill, his maiden speech when he was very young indeed in the House of Commons, was to attack overspending on defence. He actually enraged Salisbury, the Prime Minister, by talking about the costly trumpery of the good word of defence. But then, of course, by the 1930s, everything had changed and he had changed. Incidentally, he'd also left the Conservative Party and joined the Liberals because he didn't like trade wars and he didn't like tariffs. So I would say that really, as I say, I'm a lefty and I'm now finding myself in the position of being a conservative who believes in institutions, who believes in the rule of law. And these are things Trump doesn't believe in. We know that. He's a convicted felon. And we know that his supporters and his enablers don't believe in it either. And we have to sort of come to a conclusion that the left and right in Britain have far more in common with each other than they do with Trump and they do with the tyrants of the world. And we have to find an alliance between ourselves. And if that involves higher spending on defence, then unfortunately, so be it.
OK, well,
I think as long as we retain our British sense of ourselves, ironic self-deprecation and doubt and fuzziness and general general refusal to listen to Puritans or extremists, and just be somewhere in the middle. Just remember the people we speak to on the street, not the people who scream on social media.
Thank you so much for your time. A huge thank you to our panel and, of course, to all of our guests. And